Hi, Adam from the Love Brigade here, and thanks for joining us. In this episode, we'll be driving from our home in northern Germany all the way to Copenhagen in Denmark to pick up a very special piece of furniture. We'll then be bringing it back to my workshop where I'll be giving it the complete Love Brigade treatment and attempting to restore it to its former glory, perhaps even make it a little better. This story really starts out about 6 months ago when I picked up a set of 1960s rosewood and leather dining chairs by the famous Danish designer Kurt Østervig. I eventually decided that I wanted to get some matching furniture so that I could restore it and resell it all as part of a set, and so I started looking around at some of his other designs and quickly fell in love with a large rosewood sideboard with a bar cabinet in the center. This was also a 1960s design and appeared to be quite rare, but as fate would have it, I happened to stumble across one online only a few weeks later. It looked pretty beat up in the photos, and at first the guy was asking a bit too much for it, but after a few weeks of negotiating back and forth, we finally agreed on a price and made our plans to meet in Denmark. A few weeks later, we organized a trailer for the car and set out on an overnight road trip to Copenhagen. Although it would have been a shorter trip to take the car ferry, we figured it would still be less expensive to drive the long way around and take in some of the landscapes on the way, even though the land route included a €60 toll each way on the Great Belt Bridge between the islands of Zealand and Funen. After a 6-hour drive, we arrived at our hotel in Roskilde, just outside of Copenhagen, but unfortunately things didn't go exactly as planned. And it is 1 o'clock in the morning, and we are swapping hotels because we cannot switch the heater off. So, not in a very good mood about that. But apparently the new one is a 4-star, so we'll see when we get there. At least the other hotel was a lot nicer. After not much sleep, we headed back to the first hotel the next morning to collect the trailer again. We took a walk in the city, got a bite to eat, and made our way over to the storage facility where the sideboard was being stored. However, our contact was nowhere to be seen and was not responding to calls or messages either, and after about 20 minutes of waiting in silence, we started to wonder what was going on. Eventually he showed up and we went inside to take a look. I was pretty impressed with it and felt that the design looked even better in person. Although this design is not as low as the typical 1960s Scandinavian style sideboard, it is definitely longer, coming in at a 2.2 meters, and so I felt that it still retained those same stylish proportions. The most important thing for me at this stage though was to check it for water damage by just running my hands over all of the outer surfaces and feeling for bumps. Things like stains, dents, and scratches can usually be dealt with one way or another, but because most of the pieces from this era employ pressed wood body panels, they can swell up really badly if they become waterlogged and can't drain, and there's no guarantee that they can be pressed down again perfectly flat. You might be able to clamp them down again, you might not, and with such a big investment of time and money, I needed to be sure. Lucky for us, the sideboard was structurally in pretty good shape, and so the deal was done. We weren't able to get any footage of it being loaded onto the trailer, as it was an all-hands-on-deck type situation to take this thing apart and get it loaded on and tied down for the trip back in the middle of a very busy storage facility. But after some help from the good people of Denmark, we were on our way again. After another 400-kilometer trip through some stormy weather and a stop to check the trailer, we arrived back in Germany late on Sunday night. With all of the heavy rain we encountered on the way back, I was worried that some water might have gotten inside the trailer, which it had, but thankfully it was not enough to do any damage. The next morning, I went back to the workshop to take a look. There were obviously a lot of stains, scratches, and patches of heavily worn finish on the top, but it seemed to me that they were mostly superficial, and so at this stage I felt pretty confident that I could get rid of them. The overall condition of the finish was quite faded though, so there's a lot of scuffing, some tan lines on the sliding doors, which tends to be pretty common with this design style. What I also noticed here though was the overall quality of the design and the construction. I found that little details like these solid wood liners on the sliding doors are design features you can come to expect from the big names like Østervig. Normally the edges on a piece like this would just be veneered the same as the fronts. but here we see this tongue and groove type joinery fabricated out of solid rosewood, which is adding a huge amount of durability to the sliding doors, which will tend to knock up against one another sometimes. So the shelves and the side compartments share the same feature as well, though everything in these compartments is in mahogany. Moving on though, the first thing I needed to do was to get this thing cleaned up a bit before stripping it down to the raw wood. I started with a quick vacuum before moving on to a quick wipe down with some alcohol. This may not always be necessary, but I feel like the paint stripper works better when the surface is being dusted and degreased a bit. Before applying the stripper, I got underneath it and unscrewed the undercarriage assembly so that I could work on it separately. After applying the stripper in fairly generous amounts, it seemed to be doing its job, though it is often quite messy and requires that you do a lot of cleanup afterwards. My experience with heavily worn or damaged surfaces like the top of this sideboard is that the paint stripper allows you to really see what you're dealing with before you start the sanding process. You can kind of get a feel for how much sanding is actually going to be required, as any superficial damage in the top coat will often be removed by the stripper. After scraping off the bulk of the gel, I wiped everything down with some paper towels before using some mineral spirits and fine steel oil to really scrub everything down and start dissolving all of that residual grease and oil. Once everything had dried out, I started with the first round of sanding. I decided to go for 150 grit ceramic nets on the orbital, basically just to give all the exterior surfaces a quick scuff sand and remove just that top layer so that everything was all ready for the next stage. I wasn't too worried about blasting through the veneer on this one, as for one, I was confident in the thickness and density of the veneer, and two, it had clearly never been refinished. So the risk of encountering thin or worn veneer was pretty low in my estimation. Still, I'm always careful around the edges and corners, and will obviously sand things like handles and edges by hand, even if they are made of solid wood. Once I was finished with the scuff sand, I moved on to addressing some of the defects. First order of business here was the tan lines on the doors. They weren't too bad, but I wanted to see if I could get rid of them. I made up a fairly mild mix of oxalic acid and wiped them down, being careful to make sure that the surface didn't get waterlogged. I then wiped down all the other surfaces as well in order to ensure a consistent tone. Once dry, it seems to have at least reduced the contrast, and so I was pretty confident that any lines would be completely blended out by the time it had been sanded and stained. I wiped down all of the bleached surfaces with a damp cloth to wash off the remaining crystals, which can be pretty toxic. The next step was to address these scratches and dents on the main body. For the dents along the front facade, I just used a bit of instant wood filler with a light color that I could color match later on. Most of these appeared to be the result of tiny knots and cavities in the rosewood, and so I didn't really feel like trying to steam them out was going to do much. For the remaining scratches on the top, I tried using some 180 grit sandpaper, which helped in some places but not in others. The risk in these situations is that you end up sanding out a flat patch in the veneer, so I moved on to steaming them out with a damp cloth and a soldering iron, which seemed to do the trick. I then used a regular iron to do a quick steam on all of the main surfaces just to lift up the grain again and basically speed up the drying process for the final sand. I then moved on to the final sand at 180 grit, first with the orbital sander and then by hand. Once again, I used a ceramic sanding net on the sander rather than paper sanding pad, as I found that they're generally less prone to leaving sanding marks and also allow the dust to be extracted by the vacuum more efficiently. I also paid special attention to the solid wood parts, including the undercarriage. Even though some of these areas would likely never be seen, I still felt it was important to honor the design and not cut any corners in this process, making sure that there were no scratches and that all of the curves and contours were smooth and consistent. Now it was time for some color. Looking back, I probably didn't need any, but I really wanted the final finish to be consistent. So I used an oil-based Brazilian rosewood stain, cut down to about 30% with mineral spirits. This particular color is a very dark, thick stain, and even after thinning it out as much as I did, the color was still a little darker than I expected. This particular product line is actually an outdoor stain intended for use on things like fences and outdoor furniture, but I do tend to prefer these oil-based stains over water-based stains for a number of different reasons. For one, the oil-based stain impregnates the wood rather than sitting on the surface, and so I feel that the result is a little sharper and less cloudy. And two, because this type of stain helps to protect against moisture and UV damage, which can help increase the overall longevity of the finish. I like to apply it fairly conservatively, mostly just using an old rag so that there's no need to pull the excess back off again. But I'll also use a foam brush for all of the little corners and places like that that are a bit harder to reach. If there was one area that didn't need staining, it was the solid wood leg assembly. Because Brazilian rosewood is such a dense and oily timber, it can often go very dark when any kind of oil-based finish is applied to it, as it did here. But on the whole, I still felt it was a minor issue. Once the staining was done, I went back to touch up the repairs I had made with wood filler. I just used a generic furniture felt tip to blend them out and make them appear as part of the wood grain, and I was pretty satisfied with the color match. After that, it was time to call it a night and let everything dry out. A couple of days later, I returned to begin the final finishing process. For this piece, my plan was to keep the finish as light as possible, although I also needed it to be durable. I started with a very thin mix of blonde de-waxed shellac. I couldn't tell you what the exact ratios were because I make up my own shellac syrup in batches and then thin it out as needed, but in general I like to keep it thin and use as little as possible. I used a rubbing pad and a cloth to work it in, although at this stage it became apparent that the stain was not entirely dry as I was pulling some colour back off with the pad, probably due to the fact that we just had a snowstorm and the workshop had gotten a bit cold and damp in my absence. Fortunately, it didn't seem to be having a major impact on the finish, and so I just continued on. After 3 coats of shellac, I sanded everything back a little with a 180 grit sanding sponge to eliminate any little ridges or build-ups. It was at this point that I noticed there were still some light scratches on the top, most probably from the sandpaper getting clogged up during the hand sanding phase. You can't really see them in the video here, but they were there and they would have remained visible in the final finish unless I did something. What I should have done was to wet down the surfaces before staining with solvents or something, which would have made the scratches visible, but it was too late for that now. I felt that the best option here, really the only option here, was to just work some shellac into the scratches and fill them out in the same way that you would fill in the grain during a traditional French polish. After a couple of passes with the pad, I couldn't see the scratches anymore, so I was happy. In total, I ended up doing 4 coats of shellac before turning my attention to the undercarriage. I had decided to just apply a coat of beeswax polish for a little bit of contrast before reattaching it so that I could put the sideboard down on the ground again for the final stages. The next thing to look at was the light switch for the bar, situated in the right-hand compartment. It looked to me like a home repair, and I had decided I wanted to replace it with a nicer one. I did have a couple of pieces of mahogany lying around which happened to be the perfect thickness for the switch assembly, but as I don't currently have a table saw, I really just had to use what I had and basically just eyeball it as best I could. It definitely wasn't perfect, but I wasn't aiming for perfection, and I did feel it was an improvement on the existing one that would fit better with the mahogany trim in the interior. I put on a few coats of shellac, followed by some beeswax polish, let it dry out for about an hour or so, and went about installing it. thought it looked pretty good, but it was only at this point that I realized the switch was located in a place where it would never actually be seen and could not even be reached once the doors were back in position. This revelation led me to check the back of the inner right-hand sliding door, which had a channel cut out of it, which was clearly designed to toggle the light switch on and off as it opened and closed. This meant that the switch had to be precisely positioned to fit into the channel, and that my stylish new mahogany fitting was completely redundant. Unsurprisingly, the old fitting had the switch positioned exactly where it needed to be, and so I put it all back together the way it was and moved on. Looking back, it should have been obvious, because if this was the only way it made any sense. But yeah, anyway. Off camera, I'd also decided that the sideboard needed a protective top coat before I applied the final coat of wax, so I used Waterlock's original tung oil varnish. This was a new product to me, but I liked the fact that it could be wiped on like an oil and offered a thin but durable medium gloss finish. Over the next few days, I ended up wiping on 3 coats in total, which was more than I had planned, but it took me some time to figure out how much I needed to use in order to get the result that I wanted. Next step was to do a gentle sand on the top coat before the final coats of wax. I'd given the tung oil varnish a couple of days to dry out, making sure to keep the workshop nice and warm as much as I could. I used a very soft 320 grit sanding sponge to even out the surface before going over everything with the Scotch-Brite pad to get rid of any little particles that might have gotten stuck in the finish as it was drying. My plan with the wax was to work in 2 coats simultaneously. First the teak coloured brie wax, followed by the original clear brie wax. This is a technique I've developed over many different projects, which I feel gives a rich but balanced finish, and generally what I will do is after the coloured wax has been applied with steel wool, I will work it into the grain using a combination of circular and linear buffing motions with the cotton rag. Then, with the help of a heat gun, I will add clear wax on top before buffing it all out with the grain. The more even the coat becomes, the more I reduce the heat and the pressure and let it cool off. It is a long and arduous process though, and in this instance it was more or less a full day's work to get this thing waxed and polished, especially because once you buff across the grain, it is a lot of work to buff the streaks back out again and get it all evenly polished. It's definitely not what the instructions tell you to do, and the big risk in doing it this way is that you end up with way too much wax on the surface, which I did in this case. Sometimes the wax will dry out and be absorbed into the finish, leaving a balanced and even looking satin sheen, but sometimes it won't. After leaving the wax to dry out a bit, I turned my attention to the finishing touches. I took the internal drawers out and gave the sides a quick machine sand with regular 180 grit, followed by a quick bit of hand sanding around the edges to ensure everything was smooth. I then rubbed in a small amount of Danish oil just to give them a clean and consistent look before reinstalling all of the doors, drawers and shelves. After letting the finish dry out and settle down for a week or so, we did try some photography, but outside, under natural lighting conditions, it became clear that the finish was both a little patchy and a little too glossy. Most of this was down to the excess wax on the surface, so I decided to wipe all the wax off again using mineral spirits and start from scratch. As you can see here under the spotlight, there were some pretty dark patches on the doors. And although it's not uncommon to get color variation or color banding in certain cuts of timber, I thought it looked unnatural and a bit messy. I first used mineral spirits and a paper towel to wet down and melt the wax, before wiping it off with an old rag. This was a process I had to repeat a number of times to get it all off. At this stage, I felt the doors were all looking a lot more even, so I went ahead with putting some wax back on them. Although this time I chose to go for the orange oil and beeswax polish, as it is much easier to apply and gives a nice, even and natural looking finish. A lot less glossy in general than the brie wax. I worked it in with fine steel wool, waited for about 15 to 20 minutes, then buffed the excess back off again using a cotton rag. However, after putting everything back together and letting the beeswax dry out a bit, I was still unhappy, as I felt it was still too patchy, especially when viewed from a distance. This led me to go and study the original photos from the classifieds listing, where I realized that the whole left side of the sideboard had gotten significantly less sunlight, and that the dark patches I was looking at were the result of shadows being cast on the sideboard, probably over the course of decades. So I have completely stripped all the doors again and made up a fairly strong mix of bleach, oxalic acid, let it dry for about 24 hours, a bit longer than that, 36 hours now. I think it might have done the trick. I probably could have gotten away with just refinishing the left two doors, as they were the doors that had the big patches on them and were generally a bit darker than the right-hand doors. But as I was going to be bleaching them so heavily, I decided it was the safer bet to bleach them all together to ensure that the final result, once they had been refinished again, was going to be as consistent and cohesive as possible without any color mismatching. Obviously, it's always important to wipe the surface down afterwards before any sanding takes place. Now that they've been wet down a bit, you can still see a little bit of patchiness here in this center area. That was the main part I was concerned about, but I don't think there's much more I could do here really. That was the strongest mix of oxalic acid I really think I could use. I left it for 36 hours, and if this is the best we can do, then this is the best we can do. And after some light hand sanding and a fresh coat of stain, the doors continued to look more balanced, and I was confident I'd made the right decision. I then proceeded with the rest of the finish, so that's the shellac, the tongue oil varnish top coat, and the orange oil and beeswax polish. And that was it. Feel free to tell me what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching.